Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. August 31st, 2024, Coral Springs, Florida. It was the kind of Saturday that didn't make headlines. The sun was high, traffic was light, and most families were prepping for a laid-back Labor Day weekend. In a modest, well-kept home on a W43rd Street, the Malcolm family's day began like any other. But by early evening, that address would be tagged in a homicide file, locked under case number CSPD 0831124AX, and processed by investigators who understood one thing: normal never meant safe. At 5:28 p.m., the Coral Springs Police Department received an emergency call from inside the Malcolm residence. The caller identified as a teenage boy, shaken, clear, and direct. He stated that his father had been shot and that his mother was still inside the home. Dispatch instructed both children to exit immediately and wait outside for officers. The unit arrived within minutes. Entry was made without resistance. They found the man unresponsive on the bedroom floor and the woman, his wife, seated against the opposite wall. No visible panic, no immediate explanation, just a weapon on the carpet and the scent of discharged rounds lingering in the air. The body, later confirmed as Rohan Noel Malcolm, 52, displayed multiple gunshot wounds. Emergency medics noted he had still been breathing during the initial call, based on statements from the sons and evidence at the scene. However, at the time law enforcement made contact, he was pronounced deceased. The difference in those few minutes became the basis of a critical forensic anomaly. Crime scene technicians entered the home at 6:12 p.m. The front living area was undisturbed. The dining room was set for 4. It wasn't a scene of chaos, no signs of forced entry, no smashed furniture, no defensive injuries. The focus was narrowed immediately to the master bedroom. 4 shell casings were recovered from the carpet. All matched a .40 caliber Smith Wesson MP handgun found at the scene. The weapon had not been reported stolen. The serial number was registered, though not under the woman's name. Gunshot residue was later confirmed on her hands and clothing. Trajectory analysis determined that 3 bullets struck the upper torso in a relatively tight grouping, center mass. The 4th, however, entered from a steeper downward angle, piercing the left side of the victim's neck. Autopsy records would later confirm that while the chest wounds were critical, it was the neck wound that caused rapid fatality due to arterial damage. The problem, the audio captured by a doorbell camera, previously ignored by responding officers, clearly recorded a 4th shot after the children had called 911. That final shot occurred just over 5 minutes into the response window. It was not self-defense. It was a cleanup shot. The victim, Rohan Malcolm, was not an unknown face in the community. A former investigative journalist with the Jamaica Observer, he relocated to Florida in 2015 with his wife and their twin sons. In the years leading up to his death, Rohan had taken a communications role with a private logistics firm. He was regarded by co-workers as professional, composed, and in recent months withdrawn. His HR file showed a leave of absence filed 2 weeks prior to the shooting. The stated reason was family-related stress. Investigators reviewing his work laptop found no signs of financial irregularities, workplace disputes, or personal misconduct. In contrast, his personal devices, mirrored through a digital forensic warrant, uncovered a different pattern. In the month preceding his death, Rohan's browser activity included search terms such as Florida separation laws, emergency custody, how to leave safely, and protective order, Florida process. These were not abstract curiosities. They were markers of someone in fear. His Gmail draft folder included 3 unsent messages addressed to a law office. One in particular read, "If I leave, she'll make it violent, but staying is no longer an option." Neighbors confirmed that the Malcolm household had changed in tone over the past year. Once known for friendly block cookouts, their presence had faded into isolation. One neighbor recalled, "The blinds were always drawn. I figured maybe they were going through something, but not this." Another added that she'd overheard shouting multiple times but never heard Rohan raise his voice. Forensic analysts cataloged more than just ballistic evidence. The house was methodically clean. No alcohol, no signs of substance use. The bedroom, however, held details that mattered. The closet on Rohan's side had a packed suitcase. Receipts in his wallet indicated gas purchases and a hotel reservation printed for that very weekend, under his name only. A duffel bag containing documents, a passport, and a personal journal was zipped and ready. All indicators suggested that Rohan had been preparing to leave, but the departure never happened. There was no physical struggle, no attempt at escape. And whatever happened between the moment he announced his exit and the time shots were fired, it unfolded fast and without resistance. Later, during interview review, an officer noted, "There was a disturbing calm in that house, like this wasn't the first time something had gone too far." By the end of the first 24 hours, the case was classified as domestic homicide with irregular forensic sequencing. The suspect was in custody, awaiting arraignment. Media outlets picked up the story by Sunday morning, but most used vague headlines: "Local man shot in domestic incident." It wouldn't be until the medical examiner's report surfaced that investigators would realize how critical the timeline truly was. The case had just begun, and already things didn't line up. In forensic homicide work, the evidence that doesn't scream is often what matters most. In the Malcolm case, what mattered wasn't the 4 spent casings or the autopsy's confirmation of a fatal neck wound. What pushed the case into deeper scrutiny was digital: browser logs, unsent emails, draft text messages, call history, and metadata. It painted a picture that Rohan Malcolm never got to finish, but left just enough for investigators to understand he'd anticipated something would go wrong. Maybe not this wrong, but wrong nonetheless. Within 24 hours of the crime scene being secured, the Coral Springs Police Department submitted an expedited digital warrant for the victim's electronic devices. Rohan's personal smartphone, a Samsung Galaxy S22, was recovered in the master bedroom. Screen intact, lock still active. His laptop, a 15-inch Dell, was located in the office nook just off the kitchen. Both devices were processed at the Regional Digital Forensics Lab by 9:45 a.m. on September 1, 2024. The laptop yielded the first layer of insight. In his Chrome browser history, investigators found repeated searches spanning back at least 3 weeks before his death. Search strings included "How to legally separate in Florida," "Emergency custody laws for fathers," "Restraining order in domestic emotional abuse," and "Can I leave the house if the mortgage is joint?" These weren't casual queries. They were logged in patterns between 11 o'clock p.m. and 2 o'clock a.m. nearly every night. The draft folder of Rohan's Gmail account contained 3 incomplete emails, all directed to a family law firm based in Fort Lauderdale. 2 of the drafts discussed housing and custody rights. One read, in part, "I've started packing. The boys will be safer if I go quietly. I don't want to escalate anything." He never hit send. His phone records aligned with the laptop data. Over the course of August, Rohan had begun saving hotel listings, including a confirmed reservation under his name for September 3rd at a Marriott in Port St. Lucie. Screenshots of the reservation were found in his gallery, time-stamped August 28th. He'd also ordered an Uber scheduled for the morning of September 1st, set to pick him up at 8:30 a.m. That request was still active at the time of his death. A contact labeled S appeared in both his call and message history. The last outgoing text message Rohan sent at 4:12 p.m. on August 31st was to that same contact. "I'm leaving tonight. I'll let you know once I'm clear." The contact was later identified as a longtime friend, not a romantic partner. Still, the implication was clear. He was exiting the household, and he had a plan. Alongside the devices, a duffel bag found in Rohan's closet contained further indicators of departure. Inside, a recently renewed Jamaican passport, 3 bank statements, 2 USB drives, and an original birth certificate. Notably, there was also a handwritten note in his wallet. "Trust takes years. Fear takes minutes." There were no letters to his children, no visible suicide notes, no financial irregularities. But his actions suggested he had anticipated resistance. Investigators interpreted the clustering of key documents, reservation confirmations, and legal drafts as part of a quiet preparation to disengage without confrontation. One detail flagged by the lead detective was the absence of printed legal counsel letters. Rohan's laptop showed multiple downloads of Florida family law PDF guides, yet no printed versions were located in the home. "The digital trail was too tidy," he noted in the case file. "It's as if he kept everything on screen so nothing would be found if someone searched his drawers." It was a behavioral detail, not forensic in the traditional sense, but deeply instructive. Victims in emotionally coercive environments often minimize physical traces of their intentions. They don't write goodbye notes. They don't leave maps. They delete as they go. Rohan's deletion patterns supported this. Over 80 email drafts had been started and erased since July. In the month before his death, he deleted more data than he sent. The forensic imaging of his phone revealed deleted texts to an unnamed recipient referencing threats made and verbal taunting. These texts, recovered from system backups, dated back to mid-August. There was no reference to physical violence. But the escalation of tone was clear. Investigators also recovered security camera logs from the Malcolm property, routed through a third-party cloud service. While there were no saved video files, either due to auto-deletion or manual purge, the activity logs showed repeated failed login attempts between August 30 and 31. Rohan's account had been locked at 2:14 a.m. on the morning of the incident. Whether he tried to change settings or was locked out by another user remained undetermined. Digital investigators didn't conclude intent. That wasn't their job. But their report did include a single sentence under the timeline summary. Subject appeared to anticipate loss of access based on 2FA authentication failures and migration of financial records to offline storage. In forensic terms, Rohan Malcolm had been preparing to leave a high-risk domestic environment. His preparations were methodical, cautious, and private. His tone suggested avoidance, not confrontation. But if he sensed he was being watched, or that resistance would be triggered by action, he may have waited too long. In towns like Coral Springs, domestic murders aren't just statistics. They dismantle the center of family units that were already cracking. And in this case, the cracks were digital long before they became ballistic. In homicide investigations, one of the most overlooked sources of data is the neighborhood. Not the surveillance footage, not the doorbell audio. The people, those who lived across the street, walked past the driveway, heard the tension through shared air. In the Coral Springs case, what neighbors didn't say early on was as revealing as what they eventually disclosed. When someone dies behind closed doors, the silence outside often says more than anyone expects. After the scene had been processed and the initial autopsy scheduled, investigators began canvassing the immediate vicinity. They started with the properties directly adjacent to the Malcolm home. Coral Springs police conducted structured interviews with 6 residents between 6 p.m. on September 1st and 1:15 p.m. on September 2nd. All lived within a 100-yard radius of the residence. 5 out of 6 independently reported hearing arguments from the household in the past year. 3 of them stated that, in the 2 months prior to the shooting, the frequency and intensity had increased. One neighbor, whose unit backed directly into the Malcolms' backyard, described hearing loud verbal disputes late into the night on multiple occasions. Her affidavit noted, mostly her voice, very loud, screaming things like, "You'll regret this and don't walk away from me again." Never heard any physical violence, no breaking, no crashes, just her voice. The resident had never filed a complaint. In her words, "You don't interfere in people's marriage." Another neighbor recalled seeing the victim walking alone most mornings, earbuds in, often holding a coffee thermos and not acknowledging passers-by. His demeanor was described as quiet but tightly wound. According to this resident, he seemed like someone always in his head, like he was rehearsing what he couldn't say out loud. These community statements weren't evidence in the legal sense, but in behavioral profiling, they helped build context. What emerged was a pattern. A household that had gradually withdrawn from its own surroundings. One neighbor stated the couple used to entertain, used to wave, used to come to HOA meetings. But over the last year, it was like the windows shut and stayed shut. The investigation then focused inward, specifically on the twin boys. While minors and not formally interviewed without legal counsel, both sons were seen by a trauma therapist within 72 hours of the incident. Notes from the clinical sessions obtained via consent for investigative review confirmed one chilling consistency. Both children believed their father was planning to leave and had warned them weeks earlier that things might get loud. In one therapist entry, the son stated, "He told us, no matter what she says, you stay calm. Just call for help if it gets too far." The language was cautious but deliberate. It showed premeditated fear, not of attack, but of reaction. Investigators flagged this as part of the predictive escalation model, a framework often applied in domestic homicide assessments. Rohan had not only prepared to leave logistically, as detailed in Chapter 2, but he had psychologically prepared his children for disruption. This layered the case further. What had initially appeared as a sudden domestic breakdown now revealed itself as a high-tension standoff, visible to those closest but unreported out of loyalty or fear. In reviewing home layout, officers noted a critical architectural feature. The master bedroom, where the shooting occurred, shared a wall with the children's room. Acoustic testing later confirmed that any raised voices in that bedroom would have been audible next door. One of the sons stated in therapy that they heard the argument begin, then heard the first shot. Then silence. Then, after a pause, another shot. The delay was key. The layout of the room, analyzed by crime scene reconstructionists, showed the victim was shot facing the closet. His suitcase was beside him. There was no blood trail, no movement post-impact. The implication, he was shot while preparing to leave, not during a confrontation, not after a struggle. One detective added a marginal note to the evidence report. Scene suggests interruption, movement halted by force, not accident. Pattern doesn't support spontaneous violence. Another layer surfaced from utility logs. Air conditioning usage showed an uncharacteristic spike in the hour following the shooting. The system had been adjusted to 62 degrees Celsius at 5:40 p.m., just minutes after the final shot. The theory, proposed by forensics, an attempt to slow body decomposition. No other plausible reason was identified for the sudden temperature drop. This detail, though circumstantial, added weight to the timing anomaly introduced in Chapter 1, particularly the theory that the fatal shot had been fired after the 911 call, not during the immediate altercation. Beyond physical evidence, the investigation considered behavioral shifts. Rohan's workplace supervisor was contacted. In a formal statement, he confirmed that Rohan had been placed on indefinite leave at his own request beginning August 14th. The reason given: family strain. No disciplinary issues, no pending investigations. His job was secure. He was expected to return post-Labor Day, but he never made it to Tuesday. The picture now forming was not just about one night or one act. It was cumulative. Over time, Rohan had isolated himself from his friends, co-workers, and even his neighbors. That isolation wasn't passive. It was protective, measured, intentional. Investigators began to understand this wasn't a breakdown. It was the final snap in a line that had been stretched for too long. In domestic crime, the public often looks for explosive arguments, immediate cause and effect. But here, the danger didn't unfold over minutes. It unfolded over months. The pressure was quiet. The signs were present, but no report was made. No intervention came. In towns like Coral Springs, violence often wears the mask of routine, until it doesn't. The final 6 hours before a homicide often hold more answers than the crime scene itself. In the case of Rohan Malcolm, August 31, 2024, was structured, traceable, and disturbingly linear. From the time he woke up until the last bullet was fired, nearly everything he did left a digital or physical marker. What unfolded was not chaos. It was a schedule interrupted by something irreversible. At 10:22 a.m., Rohan's phone unlocked for the first time that day. He checked emails, sent a routine message to a colleague about a pending document he wouldn't need anymore, and accessed the Marriott Bonvoy app. Records confirmed his reservation at the Port St. Lucie location remained intact. Check-in was set for 3:00 p.m., September 1st. At 11:11 a.m., he purchased 2 gallons of gas and a bottle of water at a Chevron station on Wiles Road. CCTV confirmed his identity. He was alone, calm, and wearing the same clothing found on his body hours later. A purchase receipt timestamped at 11:13 a.m. was later recovered from his wallet during evidence processing. Nothing suggested erratic behavior or hesitation. Between 12:00 p.m. and 2:30 p.m., Rohan was inside the house. Wi-Fi logs showed consistent phone activity on the home network, including 2 calls to the hotel, 1 to a private storage facility, and 1 8-minute call to an unidentified contact stored as Ben Attorney. This contact had no voicemail setup, and call content was not recorded, but the call's existence indicated legal coordination remained active. Just before 3:00 p.m., Uber logs show he scheduled a ride for the following morning, 8:30 a.m., September 1st. Pickup address listed as his home, destination, Port St. Lucie Marriott. Investigators later confirmed the ride was not canceled. It simply never arrived. By 3:45 p.m., security logs from the Malcolm residence registered increased door activity. 2 entries, front and garage, were triggered within 1 minute of each other. Doorbell audio captured ambient domestic conversation, nothing elevated. The content wasn't archived. Only the log of activity confirmed the motion. At 4:12 p.m., Rohan sent a final text message. It read, "I'm leaving tonight. I'll let you know once I'm clear." Investigators confirmed it was sent to the same contact he'd messaged 2 days prior, someone listed only as S. Based on digital forensics, the number was not linked to any romantic partner. The message was one of confirmation, not evasion. At 4:57 p.m., home energy usage spiked briefly, HVAC cycling, likely due to external heat. This detail mattered only because it marked a gap in motion. From this point forward, no logs indicated that Rohan left the home, exited the garage, or returned. There were no trips to the car, no signs of withdrawal. He stayed inside. Then came 5:09 p.m. Smart speaker activity indicated a voice command. Play reggae playlist. That playlist ran for 16 minutes. Analysts from digital forensics cross-referenced song duration to confirm a timestamp that aligned with the moment investigators believe Rohan was last consciously mobile. Just before 5:28 p.m., the emergency call was made. The son's voice was the first anyone outside the home heard. His words were sharp, direct, and lined with panic. He stated his father had been shot and was not responding. He said his mother was in the bedroom, sitting on the floor. He said he didn't know what to do. From 5:28 to 5:34 p.m., Coral Springs Dispatch coordinated a fast response. 2 marked patrol units were assigned and arrived on scene by 5:36 p.m. The door was unlocked, no delay in entry. At 5:34 p.m., roughly 6 minutes after the initial call, a final gunshot was recorded by a doorbell audio sensor. The device's internal clock was accurate to within 2 seconds, verified post-incident by manufacturer sync logs. This was the fatal shot. Medical examiners later concluded that the angle of the final bullet and the level of internal trauma pointed to a single direct kill, distinct from the cluster wounds discovered earlier. The body's positioning was consistent with post-impact collapse. Autopsy confirmed no blood pooling away from the torso, no dragging or movement after the final wound. The neck shot had severed a major artery. Death was near instantaneous. That shot, fired after emergency services were already in motion, changed the case entirely. It indicated premeditation not in the heat of passion, but in the aftermath. Crime scene reconstructionists walked through the home that evening. Nothing was moved, hidden, or cleaned. The suitcase remained open. Clothes were still folded. Car keys were on the kitchen counter. His wallet, fully intact, sat beside the garage remote. He was leaving until he wasn't. There were no broken items, no kitchen knives drawn, no signs of a struggle, no chaos. The living room was untouched. The children's bedrooms remained clean. No damage, no noise complaints, just one locked moment in time, surrounded by the illusion of normalcy. Investigators concluded that the shooting did not stem from a fight. There was no defensive positioning, no blocked exits, no sign that Rohan had threatened anyone. He was preparing to leave. Based on spatial evidence, he was facing the closet when he was shot. His back was exposed. The shots came from behind. When asked to identify turning points, the homicide team cited a single detail, the timestamp of the final shot. One detective wrote in his field notes, "He was alive when the call went out. The shot came later. That's not defense. That's decision." The forensic timeline proved what most suspected but hadn't been able to confirm until then, that this wasn't an accident, nor the escalation of a mutual confrontation. It was a final act taken in the gap between panic and police arrival. That gap, forensic analysts agreed, was the window in which intent crystallized. By the morning of September 1st, 2024, the body of Rohan Noel Malcolm had been transferred to the Broward County Medical Examiner's Office. The autopsy began at 10:06 a.m. It was performed by Dr. Evelyn Hartley, a board-certified forensic pathologist with over 15 years of homicide experience. Her report would become the spine of the case, because unlike memory or motive, bodies don't lie. Rohan's cause of death was classified as a gunshot wound to the neck with perforation of the left carotid artery. 3 additional wounds, clustered center mass, had penetrated the thoracic cavity but spared the heart. Toxicology was clean, no alcohol, No narcotics. The stomach contained partially digested chicken and rice, consistent with a late lunch. There was no evidence of physical restraint, bruising, or defensive wounds. That last part mattered. Ballistics matched all 4 recovered .40 caliber rounds to the same weapon, a Smith Wesson MP semi-automatic found on the scene. The entry angles told the story more clearly than any testimony would. The first 3 shots struck Rohan from the left side, angled slightly downward. The fourth and final entered at the base of the neck from behind, with a sharper downward trajectory, perforating tissue and rupturing the carotid. Based on internal bleeding patterns and lack of reactive clotting, Dr. Hartley concluded the final shot had been delivered post-mortem or within moments of physiological collapse. Forensic terminology was clear. The victim was incapacitated when the fatal shot was fired. In layman's terms, he was down, not moving, maybe still breathing, but he wasn't fighting back. Gunpowder stippling around the torso wounds indicated the shots were fired from mid-range, approximately 3 to 6 feet. The neck wound, however, had no stippling, no burns. It was a clean shot, likely from greater distance or with a change in position. Taken together, the wounds didn't point to a physical struggle. They pointed to a calculated progression, an initial attack followed by a decisive finishing shot. Fingerprint analysis confirmed that the firearm had a single set of usable prints. Latent swabs from the magazine, slide, and trigger guard were sent to FDLE for secondary confirmation. No anomalies were found. GSR, gunshot residue, tests on the suspect were positive. Both hands, wrists, and the front hem of her shirt tested above baseline. No alternate source was identified. Crime scene photographs taken immediately after the incident confirmed the body's position was consistent with the medical findings. Rohan's torso was angled slightly toward the closet. His right knee was bent underneath his hip, suggesting he had been crouched or rotating when struck. Investigators used laser trajectory mapping to recreate the angle of fire. The shots did not come from a direct face-to-face confrontation. The shooter had a clear line to his side and back. Nothing in the autopsy indicated fear, rage, or panic. The body's condition reflected a man who didn't see the threat coming, or who underestimated the risk of staying just a few hours longer. What the medical report showed, above all, was intent without resistance. No bruises, no grabbing, no blocking, just entry, damage, and collapse. The evidence didn't explain motive, it didn't explore emotions, but it erased doubt about how the act was carried out. There's a myth that pathology is cold, just numbers, incisions, and measurements. But in reality, a body preserves what people forget or hide. The angle of a wound, the burn of gunpowder, the pattern of internal damage, it all testifies. It's not just a record, it's a voice. And in this case, that voice was clear. Rohan Malcolm didn't die in the middle of a fight. He died in the space between goodbye and gone. September 2nd, 2024. Less than 48 hours after the shooting, the suspect was transported from Broward County Jail to a secure interview room at the Coral Springs Police Department. She had been processed the night before on preliminary charges related to unlawful firearm discharge resulting in death. The booking form noted no injuries, no resistance, and no medical complaints. She declined a public defender and instead requested time to speak with retained counsel. But for this interview, conducted voluntarily, she waived legal representation. The room was wired. Audio and video were both active. No edits, no pauses. Lead investigator Detective Carver began the session. He had reviewed every available piece of evidence prior to entering that room. Ballistic analysis, autopsy summaries, the emergency call timeline, smart home logs, even the HVAC spike. The goal wasn't a confession. It was consistency. In cases like this, it's not always what people admit. It's what they leave out or how their version collapses under detail. The initial tone was cooperative. She acknowledged being present during the shooting, owning the weapon, and being the last person to see Rohan alive. But when asked about sequence, how many shots were fired, when, from where, her account failed to hold up against forensic fact. She stated the firearm had gone off 3 times quickly. But the acoustic data from the doorbell log indicated 3 initial shots followed by a gap, then a 4th. She claimed Rohan had rushed toward her, yet trajectory mapping placed his body facing away from her at the time of impact. She said he grabbed at something in the closet, but there was no weapon retrieved, no defensive posture, and no signs of struggle. His suitcase was open. His ID, credit cards, and passport were neatly stacked. When asked why she didn't call 911 herself, she hesitated. Then said she froze. But her son had called. Her son had described her as seated and silent, not frozen, composed. That contradiction was noted immediately. The forensic timeline contradicted several elements of her account. She claimed everything happened fast, in under a minute, but the spacing between shots said otherwise. Roughly 5 minutes passed between the first 3 shots and the fatal 4th. Enough time to process, enough time to change course. That delay was not reflected in her statement. At one point, Detective Carver asked her if she remembered the position of Rohan's body. She said, "On his side, facing me." This conflicted with both the autopsy report and the photographic evidence. The body was angled forward toward the closet, not toward her. The entry wound into his neck came from behind. Throughout the interview, she referred repeatedly to years of being lied to. She didn't mention violence. There was no history of domestic assault filed under either party's name. No protective orders, no 911 calls for previous disturbances. Her motive, as inferred from the interview, leaned emotional. Resentment over perceived betrayal, abandonment, and control. But the law doesn't measure emotion, it measures action. Every answer was measured against something physical: trajectory, spacing, residue, reaction. Statements that could not be cross-verified were marked. Statements that contradicted the scene were isolated. The detective didn't push for confession. He didn't need to. The point was to build the narrative from 2 angles: the words and the evidence. In this case, they didn't match. The suspect never admitted intent, but intent doesn't always require admission. It leaves patterns, pauses between decisions, actions not taken, calls not made. In criminal investigation, silence is sometimes louder than speech. Here, the silence was a 5-minute window between life and certainty, a window where a second decision was made. Not a reflex, not a mistake, but a choice. As the interview concluded, she asked, "Do I need a lawyer now?" The detective didn't answer. The tape ended at 11:12 a.m. By the end of the first week of September 2024, prosecutors in Broward County were reviewing a file that no longer required speculation. The physical evidence, forensic reports, and suspect statement had already been synthesized into a working narrative. The timeline was locked. The sequence of injuries had been verified. And most critically, the space between the 3rd and 4th shot was now a prosecutorial pivot. Rohan Malcolm had not died during an argument. He had died after it. The decision was not whether to charge, it was what to charge. Florida law distinguishes sharply between degrees of murder. First degree requires premeditation, a plan in advance. Second degree reflects intent formed in the moment, an act of rage or retaliation, but still purposeful. Manslaughter, by contrast, suggests negligence or lack of control. The state didn't view this case as manslaughter. The delay between initial harm and fatal outcome disqualified it. They weren't working with ambiguity, they were working with data. On September 8, 2024, formal charges were filed: second-degree murder with a firearm enhancement. If convicted at trial, the minimum sentence was 25 years. Under Florida's 1020 life statute, any homicide involving a discharged firearm that causes death is subject to a minimum mandatory term. No parole, no reduction. The defense was notified the same day. 3 weeks later, negotiations began. The prosecution had leverage: audio evidence, trajectory models, autopsy timing, and a failed narrative from the suspect's own mouth. But they also had something else to consider: 2 children. The twin sons, 14 years old, were now in the care of extended family and receiving trauma counseling. Neither had requested contact with their mother. Neither wanted to testify. Both had been within feet of the shooting. Prosecutors weighed the cost of a full trial against the consequences for the children. A plea deal would avoid putting them on the stand. It would preserve the facts and secure punishment without exposing the boys to further psychological damage. But the plea had to reflect the seriousness of the act. On June 11, 2025, the defendant entered a no-contest plea to second-degree murder. The court accepted the agreement. 21 years in state prison with credit for time served, no early release, no parole eligibility. She was remanded immediately. The judge did not offer extended remarks. He simply confirmed the record and moved to sentencing. There was no public apology, no family statements read aloud in court. The victim's side had chosen silence. Their grief didn't need a microphone. The sentence reflected certainty, not compromise. No contest did not mean innocent. It meant no defense. The evidence stood unchallenged. The body testified. The timestamps testified. The doorbell mic testified. The children didn't need to. Prosecutors released a brief statement. This outcome protects surviving victims and reflects the strength of the evidence. Justice in this case required precision, not spectacle. That language, though measured, captured what the case had been from the start. A clear act, clearly recorded, requiring clear response. For the record, the sentence was handed down 314 days after Rohan Malcolm was shot. Not a day was wasted. In a system that often drags, this case moved with purpose. Not because of pressure, but because the case built itself. There are no celebratory endings in domestic homicide. No verdict restores what was lost. But there is structure. There are systems. And in this case, those systems held. By the time Denise Nicole Malcolm stood before a Florida courtroom in early 2025, much of the shock had settled. The initial frenzy, headlines screaming betrayal, neighbors giving stunned interviews, a son's quiet breakdown behind closed doors, had faded into the dry air of legal procedure. But behind the clean transcripts and standardized forms was a life extinguished, and the question remained, how did it come to this? The sentencing hearing was methodical. Denise pleaded guilty to manslaughter, avoiding a trial. Prosecutors presented the forensic evidence as factual and uncontested. 4 bullets discharged from a licensed firearm, all matching the one registered in Denise's name. The weapon had been cleaned, but not well enough. Traces of Rohan's blood were still present in the slide assembly. Security camera footage from the house's smart system confirmed the time of the shots, 11:04 p.m., August 31, 2024. Her call to 911 came 22 minutes later. In between, she had texted a friend a message that simply read, "I think I ended it." Investigators later retrieved deleted messages from her phone, flagged in the digital forensic review. Some expressed paranoia over Rohan's alleged affairs. None contained hard evidence, no restraining orders, no physical abuse. Only suspicion, left to fester in silence. Rohan Malcolm was 52, a business owner, a father of 2, and by most accounts, a man who worked long hours and kept to himself. He had no significant criminal record. His autopsy confirmed the cause of death: multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and upper torso. There were no defensive injuries, no signs of struggle. He had likely been sitting when the first shot struck. Their children were placed under temporary guardianship pending a family court review. The state's Department of Children and Families initiated psychological evaluations, particularly for the younger child who had been in the house that night. That child later told authorities in a taped interview, "I heard the bang and then Mommy cried." It was determined that the children would not testify further, and their identities were sealed under Florida child protection laws. Denise received a 20-year prison sentence. The judge, in delivering the sentence, noted that while the act may not have been premeditated in the legal sense, the emotional neglect of communication and escalating distrust created a powder keg in that home. But this case wasn't just about one household. That was the part that stuck with me. When a homicide feels private, domestic, it often escapes public scrutiny. There's no serial predator, no high-speed chase, no manhunt. Just a woman with a weapon and a man who didn't think she would use it. The tragedy, then, isn't only the murder itself. It's in how invisible the warning signs remain until they erupt. What stood out to investigators, and to those of us tracing the evidence trail, was the absence of community action. Neighbors later admitted hearing arguments in the weeks prior. One even said Denise had once asked about local self-defense laws. No one intervened. The school counselor had noted that one of the children had been withdrawn and talked about wanting to sleep at Grandma's more. That, too, was unreported. It wasn't negligence in the legal sense. It was passivity, a pattern of seeing without asking. Denise's psychological evaluation, conducted post-arrest, described her as emotionally volatile with unresolved abandonment trauma. Her attorney argued that Rohan's behavior, his distance, his coldness, had emotionally destabilized her. But the court didn't consider emotional neglect a justification for lethal violence, nor should it. What it did underline was the consequence of unresolved relational conflict left to spiral. In a final interview with the lead detective, he remarked, "We always look for the motive, but sometimes the real motive is just time. Time without truth, time without talking, time where resentment becomes its own language." That line has stayed with me more than any gory detail. At its core, this wasn't the story of a cold-blooded killer, nor was it a story of a perfectly innocent victim. It was a story of silence, of a house where things looked intact from the outside, but something had long since rotted beneath. And it's in that silence that the most preventable crimes take root. 20 years is a long time, but not long enough to undo a single bullet. Rohan is gone. Denise is incarcerated at Lowell Correctional Institution. Their children will grow up knowing only fragments of the life they once had, and no amount of forensic clarity can reconstruct the emotional mess left behind. Let this case be a reminder that violence rarely begins with a weapon. It begins in neglect, in isolation, in miscommunication, and too often it ends when there's no one left to speak. In the end, what I take away from this case isn't just about crime. It's about how quickly lives unravel when communication breaks down and emotional wounds go untreated. As someone who's spent years studying stories like this, I've learned one thing. Silence is never neutral. It either protects or destroys. If this story made you pause, even for a second, I invite you to reflect. Is there someone in your life you're not really hearing? If this video resonated with you, drop a comment. Let me know what city you're watching from or how this case impacted you. And if it didn't hit the mark, tell me why. Let's talk about it. If you're into real stories that speak truth and hold meaning, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your voice matters here.